So today we begin a sermon series within which we seek to address some of our big questions. And before lockdown, we asked you to tell us those big questions with which you wrestle. A number of you sent in various questions which can be covered by the overarching big question: why does God allow suffering? I'm preaching this in the midst of a worldwide coronavirus pandemic. This deadly virus is just one of the naturally occurring phenomenon which, like many other forms of disease, causes untold pain and suffering. Why does God allow such suffering to happen? Why does God allow some people to suffer more than others? Why does God allow some people to have the physiological and emotional ability and access to the practical and scientific help to cope with and overcome these things, whilst others appear to be in different ways disadvantaged and can't overcome them? Your pre-pandemic questions ask the same sort of thing. You asked, why does God allow some people to go without water and food? Why does God's creation include creatures and diseases that often maim or even kill children? Why does God allow some families to enjoy health and wealth and happiness whilst others endure untold want and misery? The Bible does not give any clear-cut or easy answers to the question, why does God allow suffering? But it does rule out certain answers. For a start, the Bible rules out the notion that suffering goes on rampaging through the world because we're all here by chance and God does not even exist. Indeed, the Bible is one continuous testimony of people encountering the living God right in the midst of their suffering. Genuine acknowledgement of suffering and genuine belief in God appear hand in hand. So the Bible rules out God's non-existence. And it also rules out the notion that all this suffering is allowed to happen because the God who does exist simply does not care about it. We can't avoid the fact that on the face of it, some parts of the Old Testament, such as the accounts of Noah and the flood and Joshua and the Canaan conquest, do portray God as at best condoning and at worst causing the wholesale suffering of whole communities of men, women, and children. But notwithstanding those Old Testament images, as Christians, we believe that if we really want to know what God is actually like, then we need to look primarily at the person of Jesus. Matthew 5:17 records that Jesus said that he had come to fulfill what we know as the Old Testament, to fulfill the law, fulfill the prophets. And much of his teaching was about correcting people's wrong views of God, views that they were often basing upon their particular reading of what we know as the Old Testament. Jesus is himself described in Colossians chapter 1, verse 15, as the image of the invisible God. As Christians, we believe that in Jesus, God walked this earth in human form, and he was moved by compassion to help those who were suffering. The hungry were fed, the sick were healed, the grieving were comforted, the powerless and the outcast and the marginalized were welcomed and included and honored as God's children. According to Luke chapter 4, verses 18 and 19, Jesus began his earthly ministry by owning for himself the words of the prophet Isaiah, which indicate that he came especially for those who suffer, the poor, the prisoners, the blind, the oppressed. And the Bible not only speaks of God's love and compassion for those who suffer, but it also more than implies that the very reason why, in the face of suffering, we human beings are on the whole moved to help others by love, by compassion, is because, as Genesis 1 verse 27 puts it, God created humankind in God's own image. In the image of God, God created the male and female. God created them. Or as 1 John chapter 4 verse 19 puts it, we love because God first loved us. In other words, the reason why we feel what we feel in the face of suffering is because we're made in the image of God. God feels that way too. Our created instinct is that suffering is not something we can ignore. In the depths of our beings, we know suffering to be a terrible thing. The Bible more than suggests that we human creatures possess this instinct and this knowledge because we are just like our Creator. Even so, there are those who suggest that our God of love and compassion allows suffering in order to punish those who do wrong in the world. Some passages of the Bible do indeed appear to point in this direction. And from my own experience and observation, and maybe your own, we can all probably think of those times when we and others have doubtless brought suffering upon ourselves by doing or saying the wrong thing. But the Bible makes it clear that when it comes to much of the suffering in this world, more often than not, there is no causal link between a person's sin and the suffering they experience. The Old Testament book of Job is all about a man who is described as righteous and good and wholly undeserving of punishment. But nevertheless, Job and all those whom he loves suffer in the most horrific way. And when his so-called comforters argue that Job must have done something wrong to deserve all this suffering, God tells them that they're totally wrong. Similarly, on one occasion, Jesus' own disciples made the very same mistake. According to John chapter 9 and verses 1 to 3, they came across a man blind from birth. And they asked Jesus, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" And Jesus replied, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned." So the Bible makes it clear that those who jump to the conclusion that people only have themselves to blame for their own suffering are far more likely to be totally wrong than even partially right. The Bible agrees that much of the suffering in this world is just plain unfair. Many good people do die young. Many bad people do live to enjoy their ill-gotten gains, and many innocent people are left trampled in their wake. So if God exists, and God does care deeply, then why does God allow the innocent to suffer? There is no doubting the fact that much of the suffering in this world is down to the very bad words, bad choices, bad actions of human beings. Many Christian theologians and philosophers argue that God has allowed the possibility of this so-called moral evil, which leads to suffering, in order to give human beings genuine freedom to choose to love, to choose to do and be and say what is good. In its simplest form, this so-called free will defense states that God desired to create human beings who were completely free, free to choose good, free to worship and to love God, free to love their neighbour. This is a major focus of key texts in the New Testament, such as the letters of John, which make it plain that love is absolutely central to God's very being. And genuine love is always a genuine choice. However hard we try, we cannot force someone truly to love us against their will. So when the God of love wanted to create human beings who are truly capable of giving and receiving love, then he could not avoid also giving them the freedom not to choose to love. The gift of free will always carries an enormous risk. For no one is completely free fully to love if they're not equally free to choose to do evil and not good and not love. From the beginning to the end, the Bible tells stories of humanity choosing not to love, and in the process causing very great suffering, if not for themselves, for others. It is perfectly feasible to imagine that God could have created a different kind of humanity who always did and said and chose the best thing. But that kind of humanity would never have been truly free to give and receive genuine love. They would have been like soulless, pre-programmed robots. Of course, even those of us who accept this free will defense have to admit its limitations. Not least, we have to admit that whilst the free will defense helps explain why God allows the suffering caused by the moral evil of humanity, it does not explain why God also allows other forms of suffering which are caused by so-called natural evil, such as earthquakes or hurricanes, and sickness, such as COVID-19. But some theologians and philosophers suggest that God perhaps allows such things to happen because it is only in the very face of such suffering that the very best human characteristics grow and develop and flourish. Patience and kindness and goodness grow most when most tested. Without brokenness, there is no forgiveness, there is no reconciliation. Love itself is proven most when it is tested to the extreme. Because of this, one of the early church fathers, called Irenaeus, described this world of suffering as the veil of soul making. This world within which suffering is a reality is the perfect environment, said Irenaeus, within which the most valuable and mature and godly traits in humanity can grow within us. In reality, there is no really satisfying answer to the big question, why does God allow suffering? The area of theology and philosophy that seeks to give an answer to this question is called theodicy. And there is no end of books written on the subject. However, at the heart of our Christian faith lies the fundamental belief that the God who allows it to happen is far from immune to the suffering of this world. When the earliest Christians started to believe that Jesus Christ was God in human form, it was his suffering that drew them to him, that stood out for them. They believed that in Jesus, God fulfilled the prophecy, for example, of Isaiah 53, which says this: he grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised, rejected by humankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. So central to our Christian belief is the notion that God suffers with and for us. That the main symbol of our faith is the cross on which Jesus was crucified. That reminds us of his suffering. There are no wholly satisfactory answers to the question of suffering, but we do believe that the God who allows it is with us in the midst of it. As today's reading from Romans 8 put it, who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble or hardship or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? In other words, shall any suffering separate us from the love of Christ? And the answer comes loud and clear, no. No. No, in all these things, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus, our Lord. Amen.
Hello, everyone. We hope you're all having a good week so far. It's great to see you all. I think we're going to call this Wednesday Live from now on, mainly because it's on a Wednesday and we're live. So why not? It didn't really have a name before, so I think that's what we're going to call it. So once again, Mark and I are being joined together via the wonders of technology whilst not being anywhere near each other.
Mm-hmm.
But what we wanted to do, slightly different to what we've done on our Wednesday streams before, is to spend a bit of time thinking about our new themed series that we started on Sunday morning, our big questions of faith. And on Sunday, Mark, you kicked us off with probably one of the big ones, maybe even the biggest. Why does God allow suffering? What was it like preparing that sermon?
Well, suffering is such a hard topic to tackle. And in preparing to talk about it, I was keenly aware that most, if not all people who are hearing me preach on it will have experienced the hard reality of suffering in their lives. And at some point, everybody experiences illness and stress and grief, and many experience real, genuine tragedy and unfairness and hardship. And I know that for some of those hearing me preach, suffering is right now a present reality in their lives. And whilst suffering raises umpteen difficult questions, and I know that for those who for whom suffering is real and not just theoretical, even if I were able to answer those questions brilliantly, which I know I cannot, then that wouldn't remove their suffering anyway. And so as I sat down to write it, on the one hand, I recognise the need to tackle those questions head on, because that's really important. And on the other hand, I recognise that when I am experiencing suffering, what I need most of all is not some clever answers to difficult questions, but rather some assurance that I'm loved and that I'm not alone, and that someone, and particularly the God who creates us, loves us and is there for us.
Yeah. I mean, of course, the reason that we chose that theme, why does God allow suffering, was because that sort of bigger question encompassed many more specific questions that we received. You'll remember that we had the little cards out a few months ago, back when we could actually stand reasonably close together. And we had loads of questions on all sorts of different topics. So thank you if you filled those in.
Yeah.
But some of these ones related to suffering, Mark, I thought, if you're happy to, we might go through some of the specific questions that we received. Be interesting to have your thoughts. And I think probably your own views as Mark Hammond, your thoughts when you hear these questions. So if we start with one, I'm not, these were all anonymous, by the way, but this was the question: why don't some people have water or food?
It seems such a simple question, doesn't it? But the answer is very complex. The reality is that this world contains more than enough food and drinking water for everybody, not only to survive, but to thrive. And however, the reality is that some people have access to more food than they could ever have, more clean drinking water than they ever need, whilst others really don't know where the next meal is going to come from or where clean water is ever going to appear from. So for many people who go without food and drink, the main cause is an unfair sharing of these essential things. And this is what theologians refer to as moral evil. Human society is not as fair and as just as it should be. And as a result, many people are suffering. But in some cases, people go without food and drink because of some kind of natural disaster, like a drought or a flood or a crop failure. And this is what theologians refer to as natural evil, where it's really not the fault of people, but something has gone wrong in the world, and as a result, people are suffering. And in my sermon, I was really keen to address why God might allow both moral evil, the evil caused by humanity, and natural evil, the stuff that just happens in this unfair world.
I think we're going to come back to this idea of natural evil a bit later. But for now, we'll move on to the next question. Why do some families have loads of problems and others don't?
There's no avoiding the fact that whether problems are caused by moral or natural evil, the reality is that the world, for many people, is just plain unfair. And throughout my ministry, I've come across some families that have encountered one problem after another, after another, after another. And in the face of such cases of sort of multiple suffering, my first response is always to acknowledge that there are no satisfactory answers to the question why. And to say, well, sometimes all I can say, and I certainly find myself saying it a lot, is that this is terrible. What you're going through is unfair. It feels wholly wrong. And interestingly, many of the Psalms in the Old Testament are helpful here. It's like the hymn book of the Bible. And the words in there, many of them just show that it really is. It's perfectly okay. It's all right. It's not wrong for us to express to God when we feel angry and confused and disappointed and frustrated with the problems that we face. Sometimes everything within me wants to cry out, this is unfair and this should not be happening. So, yeah.
And it is interesting, isn't it, how many of the Psalms, but actually there are lots of other places in the Bible as well, where people are angry with God and people are lamenting and crying. And it's, the Psalms, as you say, they're sort of the hymn book of the Bible, and it brings out that. Sometimes I do wonder if in our worship we are very positive. We are saying thank you and we are praising God, but maybe sometimes there is there's room to have that sort of feeling of things sometimes are just not fair.
Yeah. Lamentation is part
Lamentation.
is part of the biblical text, that actually we can lament and grieve and for the way things are. That's
Yeah. By the way, if any of you watching want to comment on any of this, feel free to pop it in the comments. We might have some time at the end just to have a look at some of those. So feel free to join the discussion. The next question that we received, I actually think we received 2 questions pretty much the same on this. Why didn't God intervene in the World War II concentration camps?
Yeah, well, the question, why doesn't God do something? Why doesn't God intervene is a huge one, because at the heart of the Christian faith is the firm belief that the God who created and sustains this universe is a God who loves us. And yet it is clear that during the Second World War, this God of love did not intervene to prevent the systematic murder of 6 million Jewish men, women, and children. And personally, I think that the so-called free will defense that I described in my sermon goes a long way to explaining why God might allow such wholesale moral evil to happen. I treasure and I do not take for granted that God has given me a measure of free will that enables me to choose genuinely to love and to care and to accept other people. And I also recognize that in myself, this same measure of free will means that I can also choose, and sometimes do choose, genuinely not to love. I can choose to hate and harm and reject other people. And I believe that love is the most precious and powerful thing in the whole of creation. And I cannot conceive how awful, meaningless existence would be if love were not in the mix. But the free gift of free will that enables me and you to choose to love others comes with the horrible risk that we may choose not to love. We may choose to hate. And the concentration camps are an extreme example of what happens when people choose not to love their neighbours. And in the face of that terrible level of suffering, I have to admit that whilst my head comprehends what the free will defense is saying, my heart still struggles with it quite a bit, because that level of suffering is just intolerable. It's just horrific.
Yeah. I mean, one of the reasons we're doing this series is, that we have a feeling that our faith is strong enough to withstand these sorts of questions. But I think this next one is probably one that we receive, but it's one that for me, I've been asking a lot over the years, which is, why would a loving God create nature that can kill? For example, parasites in the eyes of children in third world countries.
Yeah. Well, and this raises what is known by theologians as natural evil, through which innocent people suffer through such things as diseases, parasites, earthquakes, tsunamis. Whilst we can try to reduce the impact of these things, and we should try and reduce the impact of these things by not allowing people to settle within areas of danger, much of the suffering caused by natural evil is simply unavoidable. It cannot be blamed on people. And so I have to admit that I've got every sympathy for those whose experience of this natural evil leads them to conclude that there is not a loving God. I can see exactly the logic of that. And I come across people who say that to me a lot. But as I mentioned in the sermon, one of the early church fathers, a guy called Irenaeus, observed that wherever such terrible suffering happens, the very best of humanity also flourishes in bringing out beautiful characteristics such as compassion and self-sacrifice and loving kindness. But to me, there's no avoiding the fact these positive spin-offs don't really seem to outweigh the seemingly random death of innocent people. There's a line in Romans 8 verse 21 though that maybe hints at something else that's behind this. In it, St. Paul says that a day is coming when the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay. Romans 8:21. The creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay. This notion that everything in creation is currently in bondage, enslaved to decay, suggests that God did not intend this for creation. God, I don't think, intended natural evil to be alive in the world, causing suffering. And St. Paul is saying that God is in the process of bringing liberation to the whole of creation from this bondage to decay, which suggests that we are currently caught in a kind of, well, some theologians have called it like a cosmic battle, which is affecting not just humanity, but every part of creation. It's not just humanity that's gone wrong and turned its own way and become selfish and inward looking and unloving. It's as if part and parcel of that, connected with that, is the whole of creation's gone wrong. And now while that raises all sorts of additional questions, which we haven't got time to deal with today, but it does appear to ring true with what we know and experience in the world, this kind of cosmic battle raging. There's good and there's evil. Even within each of us, there's this battle going on. And it's not just going on within us, it's going on everywhere. And maybe this natural evil is part of that.
I think this last question reminded me very much of a video that went viral a few years ago now. It was from Stephen Fry. It was part of a TV interview that he did, where he was asked, what would he say to God if God did turn out to exist? Stephen doesn't believe in God, but the interviewer said, if you did end up in heaven, what would you say to God? And Stephen said that he would list a number of diseases and creatures that cause terrible harm to people and to children. And he'd say to God, how dare you? How dare you create a world to which there is such misery that is not our fault? It's not right. It's utterly evil. I just wonder, how would you respond to Stephen if you were there when he'd said that?
I remember seeing that interview, and the thing that shocked me about it wasn't what Stephen said, but the sort of look on the interviewer's face, which was, I just think, didn't. Yes, this sort of pious upset. I personally hear what Stephen Fry said, and I well understand the level of anger about the existence of natural evil in creation that he expresses. And I would say that I share that sense of outrage. It seems all wrong. But also, I believe that God is not immune and God is not separate from all of that suffering. I believe that God not only shares Stephen Fry's outrage, but more than that, I believe that in Jesus Christ, God suffers with and God suffers alongside all who suffer. God's caught up in it, not separate from it. And so, so I've got so much empathy for where Stephen Fry's and a great respect for what he's saying, but I reach a different conclusion.
Yeah. So those questions were what we received, and those are why we sort of did Sunday morning's sermon on this theme. We've had a few emails since Sunday. So I thought I'd read some of these out. One says, many years ago, I got into a discussion with another member of church regarding The Shack, which we had both read. She was adamant she didn't like the book because she didn't believe that God would allow Missy to suffer so much. I said that God was with Missy during her suffering and his love was supporting her. And I see that Anna in our comments has put a question that I think is very related to this. Anna says, do you think that God plans our suffering to strengthen our dependence on him, our faith and hope? Or do you think this that is a positive outcome of random suffering? The question that it sort of occurred to me is, does God deliberately bring people into suffering?
I don't believe that God causes suffering to happen. I really struggle. I struggle with that. I struggle with the idea of that. I understand why some people believe that, but I don't believe that. I don't believe God causes suffering to happen. But I do believe that God allows suffering to happen, and that God stands alongside all who suffer right in the midst of their suffering. And many people speak of having experienced being given a sense of peace and hope and strength right in the midst of their suffering. So, I don't think God causes it, and I don't think God leaves us to it. I think God is in it with us.
This topic reminds me of a book I read. It's called Where the Hell is God? I think for me, it's a really good book on this topic of suffering. It's by Father Richard Leonard. He's a Jesuit priest in Australia. And he wrote it after his wife suffered a terrible accident, which left her extremely unwell. And he found that loads of his Christian colleagues and friends made an assumption about his wife, or even the whole family were being punished for something that they had done or they had thought, and that this accident was a necessary event to force a change in their way of being or thinking. And the truth is, there does seem to be much, probably in the Old Testament, that suggests that might be true, doesn't there?
Yeah, as I said in my sermon, there are plenty of stories in the Old Testament. I mean, just think of, Noah and the flood, Moses leading, the Exodus, and all those plagues, the conquest of Canaan, which suggests that God may occasionally cause people to suffer. And I've got to admit that I really struggle with that, squaring that with what we know of Jesus, of God through Jesus Christ. I mean, I believe that we see God's authentic character, God's authentic way of working in the person of Jesus Christ. We as Christians, we believe, Jesus is God incarnate, is God made human being, and he's the image of the invisible God, as Colossians 1:15 says.
Yeah.
So in Jesus, God does not cause our suffering, but rather he shares in our suffering and then transforms that suffering for good. And one of my favorite Bible verses is Romans 8 verse 28, which says, in all things, and all things includes the worst of things, in all things God works for the good of those who love him. And I do not believe that God wants anyone to experience suffering. I don't believe that is the will of God. But I do believe that when suffering comes to us, and suffering, as I say, is a fact of life, God can work with and through it in order to bring good out of it. Obviously, if you are going through suffering, and I can think of some situations I know at the moment, it is just horrible. It's just plain awful. In some cases, it's the worst possible thing that could happen. The death of a child, for example. There's just horrible things. But I don't believe God wishes that, wills it. But I believe as we bring it to God, God can bring us, as the scripture says, beauty out of ashes. Ultimately, what the Bible points to is that God intends, and in Jesus is working on overcoming evil with good, so that one day all this suffering will end. Revelation chapter 21 includes those lovely passages. I think I might be using it in a couple of weeks' time when we're thinking about death, of that image of God wiping every tear from our eyes, of there being no more suffering, no more tears, no more death, and that's the God I worship.
Yeah. And I think you're right to mention that as Christians, we see God reflected and magnified in through Jesus and his actions. And in all of the New Testament, I can't think of an example where Jesus made life worse or caused other people to suffer by something he did or he said. I mean, sure, he told people they were wrong. He told them they should change their ways, but he didn't cause them suffering, and he didn't hurt them in order to bring about a change. In fact, he explicitly told his followers to simply spread the good news to those who would hear it and then move on. And I find, that an important point to remember. Another email we had asks the question, how do we explain suffering to children?
Yeah. I think that, every child is different. And, I know as a parent myself, you sometimes can't do right for doing wrong. But I think the key advice with talking to children is to keep things simple, keep things honest, and to stick to answering the question that they've actually asked. It's so easy to think that they're asking a deeper question than they actually are sometimes, and plunge into getting lost into an adult answer, which is not always appropriate. Rather, I think we should give simple, truthful answers and make it clear to children that they are more than welcome to keep on ask follow-up questions on this or any other topic. I think it's key to keep with children, to keep the conversation going, until they want to stop it. Don't close it down. And when you don't have an answer, number one rule, and this isn't just with children, this is with adults as well, say, I don't know the answer. So many Christians I know will not step up into, do Sunday school teaching or whatever, or get involved in home groups because they're frightened of not having the answers. I've got 3 degrees. I don't know. All I know from doing all that studying is that there are more questions I do not know the answer to than I could have ever dreamed of before I started studying. So, if not knowing the answer disqualifies you from doing anything, I am the most disqualified person going. So just be honest. I don't know the answer. And I think that above everything else, though, when suffering comes, whether it be to children or to adults, the Christian response is to assure one another, assure them that we believe that we're not alone in the midst of our suffering, that God is with us, that God does love us, and hold on to that.
Yes, I do find it interesting how all throughout the Bible, we meet people who are on the receiving end of incredible suffering, dreadful situations, but they don't use that. They don't see that as a reason that God doesn't exist. And sometimes we assume that if we don't have a good answer to this, people are just going to go, well, God doesn't exist then. But actually, it's all about acknowledging God in our exploration
Mm.
of the answers and of our experiences.
Yeah.
I reckon, anyway.
Yeah.
One more email then. I accept that God created the universe, but I doubt we'll fully ever understand it. It seems possible to me that God does not have control of the universe, and so suffering happens. And it's not God allowing suffering, as the question suggests.
That's great. That, yes. I mean, there are many people who believe that creation is akin to a complicated piece of clockwork, and that God is like a cosmic clockmaker who is intimately involved with the creation of his clock, but then steps away and leaves the clockwork to run by itself without any more interference. And this notion of God setting the whole of creation going and then stepping away to leave it to its own devices is quite a common one. And I suppose if you were starting with a complete blank piece of paper and trying to come up with the notion of God, you might easily arrive at that conclusion. And the name for this view of God is something called deism. Deism was quite common among certain scientists and others about 150 to 200 years ago. But the Bible does not share this view of God. Instead, the Bible suggests that God continues to be intimately involved in creation, and says that in Jesus Christ, God has quite literally taken on our humanity in the midst of creation. So yes, God is known to us as God the Father, the creator of the heavens and the earth, who's put in place all of its order and beauty and natural laws and systems, without which we couldn't sort of operate as we do. We would have nothing to trust in if there weren't all this stability. But we also encounter God, we believe, in the person of Jesus Christ, who suffered for us. And we also encounter God in God's Spirit, who, when suffering comes, Jesus says, the Spirit of God. It comforts us, strengthens us, equips us to face it, gives us an assurance of God's love and God's activity in the world. So, I think whilst I understand the conception of the God of the deists, I don't see that being described in the scriptures.
Yeah. This time is marching on. I didn't realize it would take us this time. I hope you're finding this useful. If you're watching it and you're appreciating this, do give us some feedback as to whether you like this, don't like this. We're really open to hearing what you say. Just looking at some of the comments, I can't see it all on there, but Sally has said this, a quote from C.S. Lewis: "Try to exclude the possibility of suffering which the order of nature and the existence of free wills involve. You find that you have excluded life itself."
Mm.
Yes, C.S. Lewis had a way of putting things so condensely.
Yes, if only he was here to answer our questions.
Marilyn Richardson: "I think that natural evil sometimes depends on outcome. If an earthquake happens in an unpopulated place, it's a physical phenomenon. Our world depends on physics to work. It allows us to live with predictability. If we ignore what's predictable, i.e. by building intensively on a fault line, millions will die and the same earthquake becomes evil." But it is actually the same physical phenomenon, or perhaps that's too simplistic. There we are. These are all the questions, aren't they? So I wonder, just considering all the questions we received and what we've heard, as an overall summary, Mark, I'm going to put the very original question to you again. Why does God allow suffering?
And I suppose, as I said at the beginning, I want to sort of reiterate that suffering is not something you can brush off easily. It's a terrible reality for many people today, and I don't believe there are fully satisfactory answers to that question. Why does God allow suffering? I think, let's face it, after all the ink that has been spilt on this subject, if there was a satisfying answer, we would know it. We wouldn't be having this discussion. But what we can say in the face of suffering is this: the power at the heart of the Christian faith is that in Jesus, God suffers with and for us, and has promised to be there with us in the midst of the suffering. And God has commanded us to work with the Spirit of God to bring comfort, to bring help to all who are suffering, just as Jesus. That's the ministry of Jesus, bringing liberation from pain and suffering. And ultimately, in Jesus Christ, we believe that God is one day going to bring an end to all the suffering. Suffering is not God's intention. And so I acknowledge, those who want clear-cut, ironclad answers to the question of suffering are going to be disappointed. I'm disappointed, but the substance of the gospel of Jesus Christ is all about enabling us to live in the midst of suffering.